The air was a thick, viscous soup of iron and putrefaction, clinging to the inside of my nostrils, burning. It was the smell of a forgotten morgue, mixed with crude oil and stale sweat, a sickening perfume that announced the arrival of death long before you saw it. My lungs burned with every shallow gasp, not just from the stench, but from the raw, ragged edge of pure terror. My back was pressed against the cold, grimy bulkhead of the utility tunnel, the vibrations of the rig's dying heart thrumming a morbid rhythm through the steel. The sounds, God, the sounds. The wet slosh of something heavy dragging itself closer, punctuated by a guttural, tearing rasp. A sound I'd come to know intimately, the sound of meat being ripped from bone. And beneath it all, the ragged, desperate wheezing of what might have been a human voice choking on its own blood. I could see their shadows first, long and distorted under the emergency strobes that flickered like dying embers, turning the narrow passage into a pulsating hellscape. 3 of them, maybe 4, shambling forward, their forms grotesque parodies of men. One was missing a leg, dragging itself with an unholy determination, its exposed femur slick with something dark. Another's jaw hung loose, a cavernous, drooling maw that clicked and clacked with mindless hunger. The sheer, relentless pressure of their advance was a physical force, pushing me deeper into the cold steel. My hands, slick with sweat and something else, probably blood, someone's, maybe my own, fumbled with the worn grip of my shotgun. The recoil would be brutal in this confined space, deafening, but it was all I had left. My eyes darted to the single dented fire hatch behind me. Locked, always locked. I was trapped, surrounded. The air grew colder, even as the sweat trickled down my spine. The first one was almost upon me, its putrid breath a hot, rancid gust against my face. Its ruined hand, claws still attached to rotting flesh, reached. But to understand how I ended up here, we need to go back 12 hours. The rhythmic thrum of the rig was usually a comfort, a constant, deep pulse beneath my boots that meant everything was operational, the world spinning as it should. Today, it felt like a growing tremor, a low-frequency hum of unease. My name is Finn, and I've been a senior security officer on Rig 702 for 7 years. 7 years of checking manifests, monitoring cameras, breaking up fights over poker debts, and occasionally fishing a drunken roustabout out of the drink. Monotony was my daily bread, seasoned with the ever-present tang of sea air and diesel fumes. That Tuesday morning, the monotony felt off. My name is Finn, and I've been a senior security officer on Rig 702 for 7 years. 7 years of checking manifests, monitoring cameras, breaking up fights over poker debts, and occasionally fishing a drunken roustabout out of the drink. Monotony was my daily bread, seasoned with the ever-present tang of sea air and diesel fumes. That Tuesday morning, the monotony felt off. I was in the main security office, a cramped, windowless box deep within the rig's central platform, staring at a bank of flickering monitors. Outside, the North Atlantic was its usual gray, unforgiving self, a vast, indifferent expanse stretching to every horizon. Inside, the usual morning chatter was muted. Rig Supervisor Henderson, a man whose face was perpetually etched with the worry lines of 3 decades at sea, sat hunched over a satellite phone, his voice a low, urgent murmur. "Still nothing, HQ," Henderson said, rubbing a hand over his balding scalp. "Comms out across the entire quadrant, not just us. Supply choppers officially overdue by 4 hours, and we've heard squat. Weather's clear, so that's out." I leaned back in my worn office chair, the synthetic leather groaning a protest. No chopper was a problem. Missing comms was a bigger problem. No comms and a missing chopper? That was an alarm bell, subtle at first, like a distant foghorn, but growing in urgency. My eyes scanned the rig's internal cameras. Deckhands moved with their usual deliberate pace. Engineers huddled over consoles. Cooks prepped lunch in the galley. All appeared normal, yet the hum of the rig felt like it was shifting key from comfort to discord. "Any word on that outbreak?" I asked Henderson, keeping my voice level. We'd been getting fragmented reports over the last few days, mostly whispers from the mainland, from relief crews, about a new, particularly virulent strain of flu. Something different, more aggressive. It had started in some remote fishing towns, then spread. The official line from HQ had been contained, localized, no threat to offshore operations. Standard corporate bullshit. Henderson sighed, scrubbing his hand harder against his scalp. HQ's being tight-lipped, said to maintain strict quarantine protocols, limit non-essential personnel movement, the usual drill for a flu season. But, he trailed off, looking out through the reinforced porthole of his office, seeing only the vast, empty ocean. They didn't sound like themselves. Too many pauses, too much forced calm. He finally hung up, the click of the phone echoing in the tense silence. "All right, Finn, I want you to double down on our perimeter checks. All exterior doors, access hatches, verify all seals. Anyone coming or going, you log their blood type, their last meal, and their life story, no exceptions. And tell Vargas to prep the emergency comms buoy. If the satellite's down, we'll need line of sight." "Understood," I said, rising. Vargas was my second in command, a wiry ex-Marine with a permanent scowl and a knack for spotting trouble before it fully materialized. He was probably already halfway through his own mental checklist. As I walked the gangways, the scent of brine and diesel felt sharper, less familiar. The steel underfoot felt colder. I passed rig medic Dr. Elena Petrova, a no-nonsense woman with a permanent frown and eyes that missed nothing. She was talking animatedly into her comms unit, her voice hushed, her face pale. When she saw me, she cut the conversation short, offering a tight, almost forced smile. "Everything all right, Doc?" I asked, leaning against a railing overlooking the churning sea below. "Just standard medical checks," she said, her eyes flicking nervously towards the open door of the infirmary. "Some of the crew are feeling a bit under the weather. Nothing serious, standard flu symptoms, just being cautious." Her words, meant to be reassuring, had the opposite effect. I noticed the tremor in her hand as she adjusted her glasses. Petrova wasn't a woman given to tremors or forced smiles. She usually had the emotional range of a granite slab. The smell of disinfectant, usually clean and clean, now seemed to carry a faint, acrid edge beneath it, like something trying to hide. "Keep me updated, Doc," I said, trying to project calm. My gut, however, was clenching. Flu? Sure. But the mainland reports had mentioned something about extreme aggression, high fever, delirium, not just sniffles and coughs. My patrol started, a circuit of the rig's extensive perimeter. Each door, each hatch, I personally verified. The heavy steel felt like a flimsy shield against an invisible threat. The wind howled a monotonous tune, and the waves crashed against the rig's legs, sending spray high into the air. The vastness of the ocean, usually a source of quiet awe, now felt like an isolating prison. There was no escape out here, no hiding place. I met Vargas near the helipad, his face a grim mask. "Boys prepped, Finn, but it's not just the satellite. We're getting interference on all frequencies, shortwave, emergency channels, everything. Like the whole goddamn sky just went silent, or got jammed." He gestured vaguely at the swirling gray clouds. "Feels like the world just packed up and left without telling us." "Any strange vessels on radar?" I asked, my gaze sweeping the horizon. The ocean was empty, save for a few distant oil tankers on their usual routes, tiny specks against the immensity. Vargas shook his head. "Negative. Just the usual ghosts of the deep. Nothing anomalous. Yet." He spat into the sea, a small white glob disappearing into the foam. "Still, Henderson's got a knot in his stomach the size of a bowling ball. He's ordering everyone to their bunks for a full head count, minimal crew on deck." This was unusual. Henderson was a stickler for routine. Disrupting the rig's operations like this meant he was genuinely spooked. I pulled out my comms unit. Dead air. Just a faint, static hiss. "Well, let's get this head count done," I said, pushing down the growing sense of dread. "I'll start on A deck. You take B. Make sure everyone's accounted for and tell them to stay put unless absolutely necessary." The bunks, usually bustling with card games and easy banter, were quiet. Crewmen lay in their bunks, some reading, some staring blankly at the ceiling. The air was heavy, charged with unspoken anxieties. I saw a few men with flushed faces, their eyes glassy, but they waved me off, mumbling about a bad head cold. I logged their names, trying to sound reassuring, but my heart was doing a frantic tattoo against my ribs. Petrova's standard flu symptoms were starting to feel like a gross understatement. By the time I'd completed A deck, a full hour had passed. I met Vargas back in the security office. He slammed his hand on the desk, his jaw tight. "We're short one. Jensen, deckhand, C block, not in his bunk, not in the mess, not accounted for anywhere." My blood ran cold. Jensen was a quiet, reliable guy, not the type to wander off or pull a prank. "Did you check his locker? Any notes? Anything?" "Clean, like he just vanished into thin air," Vargas said, running a hand through his short, bristly hair. "And here's the kicker. I saw a few more guys with that feverish look, coughing, shivering. A couple of them were disoriented, said they felt fuzzy." "Henderson needs to know," I said, already striding towards the rig supervisor's office. Henderson, face ashen, was already on the phone again, shouting into the dead line, desperation creeping into his voice. "Jensen? Missing? Oh, for Christ's sake!" He slammed the phone down. "All right, Finn, Vargas, initiate a full rig lockdown. Secure all non-essential areas. Search parties for Jensen. 2-man teams, armed. Take the 12-gauge, Finn. Vargas, you take the MP5. This isn't a drill anymore. Something's happening out there. Or worse, in here." The word armed echoed in my head. We had a small armory for extreme emergencies, piracy threats, major industrial sabotage. This felt different, more insidious, like a rot from within. Vargas and I geared up. The shotgun felt heavy and cold in my hands. The familiar weight was both comforting and terrifying. I'd trained with it, of course, but never expected to use it in anger, certainly not against a missing deckhand. The rig lights, usually bright and clinical, suddenly felt inadequate, casting long, nervous shadows that danced with the pitching of the platform. "Let's sweep the lower decks first," I suggested. "Engine room, storage, pipeworks. Jensen usually pulls night shift on maintenance down there." The lower decks were a labyrinth of pipes, machinery, and dim industrial lighting. The smell of oil and hot metal was stronger here, mixed with the damp, earthy scent of the sea. Every clang, every hiss of steam, every groan of the rig's structure made us jump. My senses were on overdrive, straining to hear anything above the mechanical din. Vargas, ahead of me, kept his weapon at the ready, his eyes constantly scanning. We moved slowly, methodically through the bowels of the rig. The air grew thicker, hotter. The deeper we went, the more claustrophobic it felt. The sheer scale of the machinery, the massive pumps and valves, loomed around us like metallic giants. It was a place designed for efficiency, not for hiding. We checked every nook, every maintenance tunnel. Jensen was nowhere. But as we passed through a storage bay, a subtle, disturbing detail caught my eye. A trail of small, dark droplets on the grimy steel floor. "Vargas, hold up." I knelt, touching a finger to one of the drops. It was thick, viscous, and smelled faintly of iron. Blood. "Fresh?" Vargas asked, his voice tight. "Too dark to be oil. And it's not just blood," I said, looking closely. There was a faint, almost imperceptible sheen, like mucus, and something else. A sickly sweet, putrid undertone beneath the metallic tang. It was a smell I couldn't quite place, but one that instantly prickled the hairs on my arms. The trail led deeper into the maze of pipes, towards a rarely used section of the ballast tanks, a place only accessed for deep maintenance or emergency repairs. The air grew heavier here, the humidity oppressive. The sounds of the rig seemed to recede, replaced by a low, almost imperceptible scratching. "You hear that?" Vargas whispered, his hand tightening on his MP5. I nodded, my breath held. It sounded like something scraping against metal, a rhythmic, deliberate sound. Not a machine, something biological. The blood trail led us to a heavy, rust-streaked hatch, usually secured with a triple lock and a "Do Not Enter" sign. Now, the sign was ripped, hanging precariously from one screw, and the top lock was hanging open, snapped clean off. A fresh, deeper gouge marked the steel around the handle. "Someone forced this," Vargas breathed, his eyes wide. The scratching sound was louder now, coming from inside. It was a relentless, unsettling rhythm, accompanied by something else, a low, gurgling moan, a sound of profound distress or something worse. The putrid smell I'd noticed earlier was much stronger here, cloying and nauseating. It was the smell of decay, but not just ordinary decay. It was ripe, active, almost alive. I pushed the heavy hatch open, slowly, cautiously, my shotgun raised, ready to fire. The darkness within was absolute, deeper than the shadows outside. The air hit me like a physical blow, a thick, hot wave of that sickening, sweet rot, almost making me gag. "Jensen?" I called out, my voice sounding strained and thin in the oppressive gloom. The scratching stopped. The gurgling moan intensified, then shifted into a wet, choking gasp. And then, from the absolute blackness, came a sound that would forever be seared into my memory. A wet thwack, like a heavy sack of meat hitting the floor, followed by a series of frantic, desperate thrashing sounds, and then a ragged, choking scream that cut off abruptly, as if silenced by a sudden, brutal impact. Vargas swore under his breath, his knuckles white around his weapon. What the hell was that? "Stay close," I ordered, flipping on the tactical light mounted beneath my shotgun. The beam cut through the black, revealing a small cylindrical chamber, a ballast tank access corridor. Water dripped from the ceiling, reflecting the light in unsettling flashes. The air was thick with mist and that foul stench. And then the light found him, or what was left of him. Jensen. He was slumped against the far wall, his back contorted at an unnatural angle. His uniform was ripped, soaked in blood that was still dark and glistening. His face, God, his face. One eye was gone, a raw, empty socket. His jaw was hanging open, torn and dislocated, revealing a ruined throat. But it wasn't just the wounds, it was the expression. Pure, unadulterated terror frozen in his remaining eye, wide and staring at something beyond the light. And then the light shifted slightly, and I saw it. Coiled around Jensen's legs, partially hidden in the shadows, was something else. A human shape. No, a thing, hunched over him, tearing at his flesh with frantic guttural grunts. It was one of our own, or what used to be. A rig worker. I recognized the tattered remains of his standard-issue coveralls. But his skin was a mottled gray, streaked with dark veins. His hair was sparse, matted with grime and something else. And his eyes, glazed over, milky white, devoid of any spark of recognition, fixed on the horror he was creating. His hands, gnarled and elongated, were tearing at Jensen's abdomen, pulling out strands of raw, bloody tissue. His fingernails were black, cracked, and seemed to have grown into crude claws. The sight was so utterly grotesque, so profoundly wrong, that my mind struggled to process it. My training, my 7 years of calm, rational security work, shattered in an instant. This wasn't a medical emergency. This wasn't a fight. This was something out of the darkest nightmare, made real and visceral in the hot, stinking confines of the rig's belly. The creature, alerted by the sudden light, slowly lifted its head. Its movements were jerky, unnatural, like a broken automaton. It turned its ruined face towards us, a low, wet growl rumbling in its throat, a sound that was less human, more animalistic, primal. A sickening, putrid spray of blood and something else, bile, spattered onto the floor from its mouth. It bared its teeth, some of them broken, others sharpened to points, gleaming wetly in the beam of my light. And then it launched itself forward, a terrifying, shambling sprint, its movements jerky but disturbingly fast. "Open fire!" I screamed, my voice cracking as I shouldered the shotgun. The roar of the 12-gauge was deafening in the confined space, an explosive concussion that rattled my teeth. The creature bucked and spasmed as the buckshot ripped into its chest, sending a spree of dark, congealed blood against the pipework. It stumbled, but didn't fall, didn't even seem to register the pain. It just kept coming, its growl escalating into a high-pitched shriek of pure, unbridled aggression. Vargas was already firing, a short, controlled burst from his MP5. The 9mm rounds peppered the creature, punching holes through its torso, but it was like shooting a phantom. The thing just absorbed the damage, its momentum unbroken. The sheer, terrifying resilience of it was mind-bending. "Headshots! Go for the head!" I yelled over the din, chambering another shell with a desperate pump. My hands were shaking, the recoil a brutal slam against my shoulder, but I aimed carefully, sighting down the barrel. The creature was practically on us, its reeking breath washing over me, the sound of its ragged gasping filling my ears. It wasn't just hungry, it was furious. I pulled the trigger again. The shot hit. A sickening, wet splat as the creature's head exploded in a shower of gray matter and bone fragments, painting the bulkhead a horrifying abstract. Its body spasmed violently for a moment, then collapsed in a twitching heap, its limbs still flailing uselessly. The stench intensified, a fresh wave of corrupted flesh. The silence that followed was even more terrifying than the noise, punctuated only by the dripping water and the frantic pounding of my own heart. We stood there, weapons trained on the unmoving corpse, our chests heaving, adrenaline coursing through our veins like poison. Vargas stared, his face pale, his eyes wide with a horror that mirrored my own. What in the hell was that, Finn?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. I didn't have an answer. My mind was reeling, trying to fit this grotesque reality into any framework I understood. It wasn't human, not anymore. Whatever flu strain they were talking about on the mainland, it wasn't flu. This was something else, something monstrous, something that tore Jensen apart with its bare hands and kept coming after being perforated by bullets. "We need to get Henderson down here," I said, my voice hoarse, finally managing to tear my eyes from the mangled corpse. "And we need to tell everyone. This isn't a containment breach. This is an infestation." The word hung in the air, heavy and dark, sealing our fate. The rig, our island of steel, was no longer safe. The enemy was already within, and we had just killed one of our own. The sickening truth was just beginning to claw its way into our consciousness. This wasn't just a threat to the rig, it was a threat to humanity itself. And we were isolated, miles from any help, with a rapidly growing horror in our midst. The North Atlantic, once a symbol of isolation and protection, now felt like a vast watery grave. The silence that fell after Jensen's collapse was even more oppressive than the primal screams that had preceded it. It pressed down on us, thick and heavy, like the crushing depths of the North Atlantic. My ears rang, a high-pitched whine competing with the frantic thump, thump, thump of my own heart against my ribs. The smell was a punch to the gut, a coppery metallic tang of fresh blood, overlaying the acrid stench of burned powder, and something else, something indescribably foul and organic, like a butcher shop left to rot in the sun. My throat felt like sandpaper. I could taste the metallic tang of fear, like a mouthful of old pennies. Vargas was still locked on the unmoving mass, his chest heaving, his rifle held steady, despite the tremor in his hands. His eyes, usually sharp and focused, were glazed with a raw terror that mirrored the ice-cold dread spreading through my own gut. Infestation, he finally choked out, the word barely a whisper, yet it echoed in the vast oily expanse of the pump room. It hung there, an ugly truth, staining the air. My gaze was still fixed on the mangled remains of what had once been Jensen, a man I'd shared bad coffee and worse jokes with. Now, just a pile of twitching meat, a testament to a horror no one had ever prepared us for. The raw, jagged edges of his torn flesh were stark against the greasy metal deck, a perverse crimson abstract. Blood seeped into every crack and crevice, mingling with the ever-present sheen of oil and salt water. It looked alien. It was alien. "Henderson," I repeated, my voice hoarse, finally tearing my eyes away. The name was a lifeline, a desperate plea for order in a world suddenly plunged into chaos. Henderson, the rig's operations manager, the man who knew every pipe, every conduit, every secret of this colossal beast of steel. He would know what to do. He had to. We need to get to him, and we need to tell everyone. Vargas nodded, swallowing hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. He lowered his rifle slightly, though his grip remained bone-white tight. His eyes, usually sharp and focused, were glazed with a raw terror that mirrored the ice-cold dread spreading through my own gut. Infestation, he finally choked out, the word barely a whisper, yet it echoed in the vast, oily expanse of the pump room. It hung there, an ugly truth, staining the air. My gaze was still fixed on the mangled remains of what had once been Jensen, a man I'd shared bad coffee and worse jokes with. Now, just a pile of twitching meat, a testament to a horror no one had ever prepared us for. The raw, jagged edges of his torn flesh were stark against the greasy metal deck, a perverse crimson abstract. Blood seeped into every crack and crevice, mingling with the ever-present sheen of oil and salt water. It looked alien. It was alien. "Henderson," I repeated, my voice hoarse, finally tearing my eyes away. The name was a lifeline, a desperate plea for order in a world suddenly plunged into chaos. Henderson, the rig's operations manager, the man who knew every pipe, every conduit, every secret of this colossal beast of steel. He would know what to do. He had to. We need to get to him, and we need to tell everyone. Vargas nodded, swallowing hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. He lowered his rifle slightly, though his grip remained bone-white tight. "Comms room, then?" I didn't answer immediately. My mind was racing, trying to map out a path through the labyrinthine corridors of Rig 73. Every shadow seemed to deepen. Every creak of settling metal felt like a predator stalking us. The rig, usually a cacophony of whirring machinery and distant shouts, was eerily quiet, too quiet. The only sound was the incessant drip, drip, drip of condensation from overhead pipes and the ragged rhythm of our own breathing. The air was heavy, charged with an invisible threat. It made the hairs on my arms stand on end. "No," I finally said, the word emerging as a rough rasp. "Too central, too obvious. They'll expect us there. Henderson's office. He has a direct line, secured, and a panic room keycard." It was a long shot, but it was our best shot. The office was on level 3, several decks up from the pump room. A long, treacherous journey through the guts of the rig. "All right, lead the way, Finn," Vargas said, his voice regaining a sliver of its usual resolve, though his eyes still darted nervously around the room. He took point, moving with a cautious agility, rifle held high. I followed, my weapon tracking his back, my senses on high alert. Every shadow, every glint of reflected light, every distant metallic groan was a potential enemy. The heavy, greasy scent of the pump room clung to us, a grim reminder of what we'd just faced. We moved, slowly at first, through the narrow catwalks of the pump room, the metal grating cold and unforgiving beneath our boots. The air grew heavier with each step, thick with the metallic tang of salt and fear. We reached the main service corridor, a long steel tunnel lit by flickering fluorescent lights that cast long, dancing shadows. This corridor, usually bustling with engineers and roughnecks, was deserted. The silence was unnerving, a stark contrast to the usual industrial hum. It felt like the rig was holding its breath. Then it started. Not a bang, not a shout. It began as a deep, resonant thrum that vibrated up from the very deck beneath our feet. It wasn't the familiar rhythmic pulse of the rig's engines, nor the steady drone of the pumps. This was different. Lower, deeper. It felt like a groan, a dying shudder from the very heart of the colossal steel beast. The floor plates rattled beneath us, sending a jolt of alarm through my already frayed nerves. "What the hell was that?" Vargas hissed, freezing mid-step, his rifle swinging up. His eyes, wide and searching, scanned the corridor. Before I could answer, the thrum escalated into a sickening screech of tormented metal, a sound that grated on my teeth and vibrated deep in my chest. It felt like the entire rig was twisting, tearing itself apart from the inside. A sudden, violent lurch sent us stumbling, our boots skidding on the greasy deck. I slammed into the cold, unforgiving steel bulkhead, the impact jarring my teeth. A searing pain shot through my shoulder, but I barely registered it. All my attention was consumed by the terrifying symphony of mechanical distress. Then, the lights went out. Total, absolute darkness descended, swallowing us whole. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drum against the sudden void. The air grew thick with the smell of ozone, a sharp metallic tang of burning circuitry. For a terrifying second, all I could hear was the frantic rasp of my own breath and the distant, dying shriek of abused metal. "Finn, Vargas, respond!" A voice, tinny and distorted, crackled in my earcom, a frantic squawk of static and fear. It was Miller, one of the junior security officers, usually stationed in the surveillance room. His voice was laced with pure panic. "The rig, something's wrong. Main power's out. Emergency lights are failing. I'm seeing movement on level 2. Massive pressure drops in the drilling manifold. Something hit the primary power conduit. Jesus Christ, they're everywhere." His voice cut off abruptly, replaced by a deafening burst of static, then a blood-curdling guttural shriek that was not Miller. It was raw, animalistic, and utterly terrifying, followed by a wet, sickening tear, then silence. A cold, heavy silence that felt like a death sentence. My blood ran cold. The monsters weren't just isolated to the pump room, they were spreading, and they were actively targeting the rig systems. Miller, respond!" I yelled into my comms, my voice cracking, but all I got back was a dead hiss of static, occasionally punctuated by that same sickening, wet, tearing sound, now distant. Suddenly, a harsh, crimson glow pierced the darkness, flickering erratically. The emergency lights, weak, unreliable, but enough to cast grotesque, dancing shadows that stretched and contorted, making every corner a potential hiding place for something unspeakable. The corridor, now bathed in this infernal red, looked like a scene from a nightmare. The air shimmered, thick with a palpable tension. "Vargas?" I hissed, my hand instinctively going for my pistol, even though my rifle was still clutched tight in my other hand. My eyes strained, trying to pierce the gloom. "Here, Finn." His voice came, strained, from somewhere to my right, closer than I expected. I could hear the rapid-fire clicks of his rifle safety disengaging. What the hell was that scream? Miller? "I don't know. Comms are dead, or compromised," I muttered, pushing myself off the bulkhead. My shoulder screamed in protest, but I ignored it. My heart was pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs, a desperate drumbeat of survival. The smell of ozone was growing stronger, mingling with the coppery tang of my own fear. Emergency power is failing. We're blind. We're cut off. A new sound began to filter through the dying rig, a rhythmic thump, 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 low and resonant, coming from somewhere above us, reverberating through the entire deck. It sounded like heavy, bare feet slapping against metal, or something worse, something dragging. It was slow, deliberate, and it was getting closer. "Hear that?" Vargas whispered, his voice barely audible above the infernal thumping. His head tilted, listening intently. I did. It was unnerving. Not the chaotic rush of a stampede, but a methodical, relentless advance. It felt like the hunter was toying with its prey. They're not just wandering, I realized, a chilling thought taking root. They're coordinated, intelligent, somehow. The implications were horrifying. This wasn't just a zombie outbreak. This was something else, something far more terrifying. We began to move again, more cautiously now, our movements synchronized, our weapons leading the way. The red emergency lights pulsed, bathing the corridor in a hellish glow, making the shadows writhe and dance. Each creak of the straining rig, each drip of water, each distant metallic clang sent a fresh jolt of adrenaline through me. My mouth was dry, tasted like dust and fear. We navigated through a maze of pipes and catwalks, the air growing colder as we approached an outer section of the rig. A sharp, icy wind whistled through a gap in a damaged bulkhead, bringing with it the scent of salt and the vast, crushing emptiness of the ocean. My breath plumed white in the frigid air. The rhythmic thumping above us continued, a sinister soundtrack to our desperate flight. Then we saw it. Round a corner, where the corridor opened into a wider processing bay, one of the emergency lights had died completely, plunging a section into absolute darkness. But in the dim red glow from the adjacent section, I saw it. A shape. Tall, too tall, and too wide. It was hunched over something on the deck. The thumping had stopped. The silence returned, thick and suffocating, broken only by the distant groans of the dying rig and the frantic beat of my own heart. I could hear Vargas's ragged breath behind me. It was feeding. A sickening, slurping sound reached us, wet and guttural. The smell was overpowering now, a stench of putrefaction and something sweet, like sickly sweet decay, that made my stomach churn. I felt the bile rise in my throat, a bitter burn. "Hold," I whispered, my voice barely a thread. We froze, pressed back against the cold steel bulkhead, trying to melt into the shadows, our rifles held steady. My hands were slick with sweat, my grip almost slipping. My entire body was vibrating with suppressed terror. The shape shifted, slowly, deliberately. It straightened, revealing a grotesque parody of a human form. Taller than Jensen had been, its limbs unnaturally elongated, its skin a mottled grayish-green hue. Bits of what looked like human flesh clung to its maw, dripping onto the steel deck. It looked up, its head tilting slightly, as if sniffing the air. Even in the dim light, I could make out the vacant, milky white of its eyes, devoid of any humanity, empty, predatory. It wasn't alone. As it turned, the flickering red light caught a glimpse of another, smaller shape, huddled further back in the darkness, almost indistinguishable from the shadows, its outline blurring at the edges. A shadow within a shadow. Was it another one or something else? My mind screamed, overwhelmed by the sheer, unadulterated horror. This wasn't just an infestation, it was an evolution, a nightmare unfolding before our very eyes. The cold dread solidified into a block of ice in my chest. The larger creature took a slow, deliberate step towards us, its head still cocked, as if listening for our ragged breaths, for the frantic beat of our hearts. Its movements were too fluid, too deliberate for the reanimated dead. This wasn't a shuffling corpse. This was a hunter. "Don't move," Vargas breathed, his voice tight with raw terror. My finger tightened on the trigger, my knuckles white. The weight of the rifle felt heavy, yet utterly inadequate. This wasn't a fight we could win with bullets alone. We were miles out to sea, trapped on a dying rig, with an enemy that seemed to be growing in number and intelligence. Suddenly, a flash of movement in my peripheral vision, a flicker in the deeper darkness of the processing bay. Something had detached from the wall, something sinuous and impossibly fast. It darted across the open space, a dark blur against the red emergency glow, before vanishing behind a stack of oil barrels. It wasn't the same shape as the larger creature, too fast, too low to the ground. An open loop, another question mark hanging over our heads. What was that? The larger creature paused, its head snapping towards where the blur had vanished, as if momentarily distracted. This was our chance, a tiny window, a sliver of desperate hope. "Run!" I screamed, shoving Vargas forward, my voice raw and cracking. We broke cover, sprinting back the way we came, our boots pounding on the metal deck, the sound deafening in the suddenly re-engaged silence. We ran, blindly, driven by pure, unadulterated terror. The air rushed into my lungs, cold and sharp, burning my throat. My legs ached, my shoulders screamed, but I pushed through the pain. We had to get to Henderson. We had to warn everyone. We had to. Then the floor vanished. Not entirely, but ahead of us, the very deck of the corridor had buckled and torn like paper, revealing a gaping, jagged hole. Twisted rebar and sparking wires hung down into the abyss below, plunging into darkness. The air was filled with the stench of raw sewage and something metallic. The rig was coming apart. We skidded to a halt at the edge of the chasm, spraying oil and water, our momentum nearly carrying us over. Below us, I could hear the terrifying symphony of grinding metal, groaning bulkheads, and the distant sloshing roar of the North Atlantic, eager to claim its prize. The rig was bleeding. Behind us, the rhythmic thumping resumed, louder this time, closer. And it wasn't just one set of footsteps. I could hear at least 3, perhaps 4. The creatures were on our trail, and they were fast. We were trapped. A gaping maw of twisted steel and death in front of us, a growing horde of horrors behind us. The air grew impossibly cold, the wind howling through newly opened rents in the hull. The rig lurched violently again, a deep, shuddering tremor that sent a shower of sparks cascading from severed wires. The emergency lights above us flickered, struggled, then died, plunging us into absolute darkness once more. And in that final, terrifying second of darkness, before the ocean's black embrace could swallow us, I heard it. Not the snarls of the creatures, nor the scream of tearing metal. No, it was a faint, almost imperceptible ping on my comms unit, a signal. Not Miller, not any rig frequency I recognized. It was distant, distorted by static, but unmistakably a human voice, a child's voice, crying. And then, just as quickly, it was gone, drowned out by the rising crescendo of metal screams and the chilling, triumphant roar of the beasts closing in. We were utterly alone, and the rig was about to become our tomb. The world dissolved. One moment, the icy, howling wind tore at us. The next, a deep, resonant crack ripped through the structure beneath our feet. The catwalk, already stressed by the rig's agony, groaned its final protest. It wasn't a gentle buckling, no. It was a violent, catastrophic fracture. The metal beneath me shrieked, a sound like 1,000 banshees gargling razor wire, and then gave. My stomach lurched, a sickening freefall that stole the air from my lungs. Adrenaline surged, a bitter metallic taste exploding on my tongue. I screamed, a raw, primal sound swallowed instantly by the cacophony of the rig's death throes. My hand shot out, scrabbling desperately in the absolute darkness. My fingers, numb with cold, closed around something, a rusted pipe, jagged and sharp, threatening to slice through my glove. The pipe shuddered, groaning under my sudden weight, but it held. Below me, I heard a splash, a muffled cry, and the frantic scrabbling of feet that quickly faded. "Miller! Elias! Anyone?" My voice was hoarse, tearing at my throat. Only the roar of the wind, the grinding symphony of metal, and the endless sloshing hunger of the Atlantic answered. I was hanging, suspended over an abyss of noise and darkness, my body screaming, muscles burning. My arm felt like it was being ripped from its socket. Above me, the rhythmic thumping of the creatures resumed, closer still, now joined by a wet slurping sound that turned my blood to ice. They were not just on our trail, they were here. My eyes, useless in the void, strained. I could smell it now, distinct even over the diesel and salt spray. A cloying, putrid scent like rotten fish left out in stagnant bilge water, mixed with something sharp and chemical like ozone after a lightning strike. It filled my nostrils, thick and suffocating. The air grew impossibly colder, a damp, penetrating chill that seeped into my bones, a cold that spoke of utter desolation. I heard a grunt, then the heavy thud of something landing nearby. A flash of phosphorescence, sickly green, briefly illuminated the twisted wreckage around me. It was Elias. He was clinging to a snapped support beam just a few feet away, his face pale, his eyes wide with terror, reflecting the eerie glow. Behind him, silhouetted against a momentary burst of sparks from severed wires, I saw it. A shape. Too tall, too gangly, with a head that seemed unnaturally small atop a hunched, powerful frame. Claws, long and hooked, scraped against the metal, a sound that grated on my very soul. "Miller! Where's Miller?" Elias rasped, his voice trembling. He pulled himself up, muscles coiling. He had lost his rifle, I could see, but a heavy wrench, salvaged from God knows where, was clutched in his other hand. "Don't know," I gasped, straining to pull myself higher. My boots scraped against something loose, a cascade of smaller debris clattering into the darkness below. "Might have fallen." The words caught in my throat. The thought was a lead weight in my gut. Miller, strong, stoic Miller, lost to the depths. Another thud, this one closer. The green phosphorescence pulsed, brighter now, revealing not one but two of the creatures. They moved with an unsettling fluidity, a bizarre blend of predatory grace and grotesque contortion. Their skin, where I could glimpse it, appeared slick and dark, like wet slate, glistening with an unknown film. Their multi-jointed limbs flexed, rippling with unnatural power. They smelled our fear, I was sure of it. The air practically vibrated with their hungry anticipation. "Miller! Where's Miller?" Elias rasped, his voice trembling. He pulled himself up, muscles coiling. He had lost his rifle, I could see, but a heavy wrench, salvaged from God knows where, was clutched in his other hand. "Don't!" I gasped, straining to pull myself higher. My boots scraped against something loose, a cascade of smaller debris clattering into the darkness below. "Might have fallen." The words caught in my throat. The thought was a lead weight in my gut. Miller, strong, stoic Miller, lost to the depths. Another thud, this one closer. The green phosphorescence pulsed, brighter now, revealing not one, but two of the creatures. They moved with an unsettling fluidity, a bizarre blend of predatory grace and grotesque contortion. Their skin, where I could glimpse it, appeared slick and dark, like wet slate, glistening with an unknown film. Their multi-jointed limbs flexed, rippling with unnatural power. They smelled our fear, I was sure of it. The air practically vibrated with their hungry anticipation. One of them let out a low, guttural growl, a sound that resonated deep in my chest, a primal warning. It wasn't just a beast. It felt intelligent, ancient, malevolent. "We need to move," Elias yelled, his voice cracking. He glanced at the chasm below, then back at the approaching horrors. Now! My feet finally found purchase on a narrow, precarious ledge of buckled grating. I hauled myself up, my whole body screaming in protest. The pipe I'd been clinging to groaned ominously, threatening to give completely. I spared a split second to check my comms unit. Nothing. Just the constant hiss of static, a mockery of connection. But then, a fleeting whisper, almost imperceptible beneath the roar of the rig's disintegration. A faint ping. It was gone as quickly as it came, just a ghost of the child's voice, a chilling reminder of an impossible mystery, drowned out by the metallic shriek of the creatures as they lunged. The first one was fast, faster than anything I'd ever seen. It launched itself with impossible force, a blur of dark scales and gleaming claws. I barely had time to react. My only weapon, a heavy-duty bolt cutter, felt pitifully inadequate against its bulk. I swung it wildly, a desperate, clumsy arc. The blunt force connected with something hard, a sickening crunch that vibrated through my arms. The creature shrieked, a piercing, inhuman sound that tore at my eardrums, and recoiled, spraying a viscous, dark fluid that stung my skin like acid. "Go! Go!" Elias roared, swinging his wrench like a madman. He connected with the second creature's knee joint, the sickening crack of bone echoing through the cavernous space. It stumbled, giving us a precious second. We scrambled, half climbing, half falling over twisted rebar and shattered piping, deeper into the rig's labyrinthine guts. The path was a nightmare of obstacles. Ruptured steam pipes hissed, blasting superheated vapor that scalded the air. Exposed electrical conduits sparked erratically, arcs of blue lightning dancing across the metal, threatening instant electrocution. Every step was a gamble. The rig continued its shuddering descent, the groaning of stressed metal a constant, terrifying companion. The creatures were relentless. I could hear their heavy breathing, ragged and wet, always close behind us. Their claws scraped against metal, a terrifying cadence of pursuit. The smell of them was a suffocating cloud, a promise of gruesome death. We were losing ground. My lungs burned, my legs ached, each breath tasting of oil, metal dust, and the undeniable tang of my own fear. We reached a junction, a narrow catwalk that seemed to lead deeper into the rig's main superstructure, or what was left of it. Below us, a cavernous space opened up, a multi-story maw of industrial machinery, now a mangled mess of pipes and girders, half submerged in the churning black water that had breached the hull. It was a dizzying, terrifying sight, even in the dim, intermittent light cast by distant, sparking electrical fires. "Left," Elias yelled, pointing a trembling finger. "It's tighter, might buy us some time." I didn't question him. We plunged into the narrow passage, forcing ourselves through a tangle of severed cables and bent plating. The walls pressed in, claustrophobic and cold. The passage was barely wide enough for one person, forcing us into a single-file, desperate crawl. The air here was even heavier, humid with the spray of internal ruptures, and thick with the cloying stench of the creatures, meaning they could still follow. Suddenly, a loud pop and a blinding flash erupted just ahead of me. A main power conduit, frayed and stressed, finally gave way, unleashing a torrent of bright blue sparks. The air crackled with ozone, making the hairs on my arms stand on end. The path ahead was blocked by a wall of raw, uncontrolled energy. "Damn it," Elias cursed from behind me. "Back! We have to go back!" No, going back meant facing the creatures head-on in this confined space. It was suicide. My mind raced, heart hammering against my ribs. There had to be another way. My eyes, still struggling to adapt to the perpetual gloom, darted around. Above the sparking conduit, I saw a maintenance shaft, barely large enough for a person to squeeze through. It led upward into the true guts of the rig, perhaps towards the control deck, or even, impossibly, a life raft station. A desperate hope flickered. "Up!" I yelled, pointing with my bolt cutters. "There!" Elias hesitated for a split second, then nodded grimly. "You first." I scrambled, finding a narrow footing on a brace of pipes. The metal was slick with oil and seawater, treacherous beneath my boots. My fingers closed around the lip of the shaft, pulling myself up. The gap was tight, scraping against my shoulders and back, threatening to snag my gear. The air inside the shaft was stale, metallic, and heavy with the scent of long-dormant machinery. As I struggled, half in, half out of the shaft, a shadow moved in the periphery of my vision, not from behind us, but within the shaft itself. It was quick, a fleeting flicker of movement, something too small to be one of them, too fast to be debris. My breath hitched. Was it the wind? My imagination, frayed by terror, or something else entirely? A shiver, colder than the rig's icy embrace, traced its way down my spine. The image of the child's voice on my comms unit, distant and distorted, flashed through my mind. "Hurry!" Elias urged, his voice tight with desperation. I heard the distinct thud of the creatures right at the opening of the passage, their wet snarls echoing, magnified by the confined space. I forced myself through, the metal groaning a metallic protest against my passage. I landed clumsily on a narrow platform inside the shaft, the sudden impact sending a jolt of pain up my legs. I turned, extending a hand to Elias, pulling him up. He landed beside me, panting, eyes wide. We were momentarily safe, sealed off from the immediate threat by the sparking conduit below and the narrowness of the shaft. The only way in or out was through this cramped opening, a temporary reprieve. False hope, perhaps, but hope nonetheless. We were encased in darkness, the sounds of the rig's demise muffled but still omnipresent. The air here was thick, making breathing a conscious effort. "Which way now?" Elias whispered, his voice barely audible over the distant roar of the ocean. He pulled out a small, battered flashlight from his belt, its weak beam slicing through the oppressive darkness, revealing a corroded ladder leading upwards, disappearing into the gloom. Above us, the ladder disappeared into an even darker void, promising deeper, unknown horrors. Below, the sparking conduit raged, sealing off retreat. And then, from somewhere above, from the very top of the ladder, a new sound cut through the din. Not the heavy thumping of the creatures we'd been fighting. No, this was a metallic clanking, rhythmic and deliberate, like something heavy being dragged across steel grating. It was closer than it should have been, far too close, and it was coming down. The metallic clanking wasn't just coming down, it was scraping, a sound so vile it felt like rust flaking off my molars. It reverberated through the cramped shaft, a grinding symphony of destruction that heralded whatever fresh hell awaited us. Elias's weak flashlight beam quivered in his hand, a fragile spear of light against the oppressive thick darkness. The air, already heavy with the stench of ozone and stale oil, now carried a new, acrid tang, like burnt wiring mixed with something utterly organic and putrid. My nostrils flared, tasting the metallic tang of fear that coated my tongue. "Up," I rasped, my voice barely a strained whisper, pushing Elias towards the corroded ladder. Every instinct screamed at us to climb, to flee from the unseen horror descending. But the shaft itself began to protest. A deep, guttural groan rumbled from the very structure, vibrating through the metal platform beneath our feet, making my teeth chatter. Dust, thick and choking, rained down from the void above, a gritty assault on our eyes and throats. The vibrations intensified, making the ladder sway precariously. This wasn't just a creature. It felt like the rig itself was collapsing around us, being pulled apart from the inside. It's heavy," Elias stammered, his breath catching, his eyes wide, fixed on the climbing darkness. The clanking grew louder, faster now, punctuated by a wet, scraping thump that suggested multiple points of contact. It was moving with terrifying speed, whatever it was. Suddenly, a section of the steel grating just above us, part of the shaft's inner lining, buckled inward with a tortured shriek. Twisted metal tore, sending a cascade of jagged shards raining down. We recoiled, ducking our heads, arms raised, as razor-sharp debris clanged off the platform and ricocheted off the shaft walls. A jagged piece grazed my arm, leaving a stinging, shallow cut that instantly bloomed with dark blood, adding a new, coppery smell to the mix. Through the freshly torn gap, illuminated by a fleeting, eerie green glow from somewhere deeper within the rig's failing systems, I saw it. Not a creature, not entirely. It was a mass. Multi-limbed, yes, but those limbs weren't purely biological. They were grotesque amalgamations of chitinous plating and crudely grafted, scavenged metal, pipes, rebar, perhaps even chunks of the rig's own structure. Each limb ended in a serrated claw or a blunt, crushing pincer. Its main body, a hulking, segmented carapace, gleamed sickly green under the sporadic light, wet with some unidentifiable viscous fluid. It moved with a horrifying, mechanical precision, each clank a calculated descent, anchoring itself to the shaft's torn framework. Its head, or what I assumed was its head, was a nightmarish fusion of insectoid features and what looked like a shattered, broken-off pressure gauge, its glass eye still intact, reflecting the ghostly green light with malevolent intent. It didn't have eyes in the traditional sense, but clusters of pinprick red lights pulsed along its armored face, like scattered predatory embers. It was an engineered horror, a thing not born but built, warped by whatever had ravaged this rig. And it was upon us. One of its metallic chitinous claws plunged through the torn grating directly above Elias, spearing downwards with bone-shattering force. Elias cried out, a strangled yelp of pure terror, scrambling backward, pressing himself against the far wall of the shaft. The claw missed him by inches, embedding itself deep into the steel platform, ripping a furrow in the already abused metal. The shriek of tortured steel was deafening, the sound vibrating through my very bones. The creature paused, its entire mass seeming to settle, its pulsing red lights focusing on us. It knew we were here. It knew we were trapped. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird desperate for escape. The claw missed him by inches, embedding itself deep into the steel platform, ripping a furrow in the already abused metal. The shriek of tortured steel was deafening, the sound vibrating through my very bones. The creature paused, its entire mass seeming to settle, its pulsing red lights focusing on us. It knew we were here. It knew we were trapped. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird desperate for escape. The smell of its proximity was cloying. Not just oil and metal, but something akin to rust mixed with decaying fish and raw sewage, an abomination of stenches. I gagged, fighting to keep my stomach contents down. There was no room to maneuver, no space to breathe. This shaft was a coffin, and the lid was closing. "Shoot it!" Elias yelled, his voice cracking, fumbling for his own sidearm. He drew it, a standard-issue heavy-caliber pistol, his hand shaking so violently I thought he'd drop it. I didn't need prompting. My own service weapon, a pump-action shotgun, felt impossibly heavy in my hands. The recoil was going to be brutal in this confined space, but there was no other option. I brought it up, aiming for the nearest cluster of pulsing red lights, the closest thing I could discern as a vulnerable point on his grotesque head. Bang! The shotgun roared, a deafening explosion in the enclosed shaft that obliterated all other sounds for a split second. The blast was concussive, vibrating through me, rattling my fillings. My ears rang with an agonizing shriek of sound that lasted far too long. The stench of gunpowder momentarily overwhelmed the other foul odors. The creature recoiled, a high-pitched metallic screech tearing from its non-mouth, a sound like 1,000 nails dragging across a chalkboard. A few of the red lights on his face flickered, then died, replaced by oozing greenish fluid that dripped onto the mangled grating. But the rest of the creature seemed unfazed. Its massive bulk remained anchored. The impact of the shotgun blast, even at point-blank range, had merely stunned it, not deterred it. My hope, a fragile thing, shattered with the echoing report of the weapon. "It's armored!" Elias screamed, firing his pistol in a rapid succession of cracks, the smaller caliber slugs pinging off the creature's carapace like pebbles against stone, leaving only shallow, insignificant divots. "It's not working!" The creature's screech faded, replaced by a low, grinding growl, a sound that seemed to come from deep within its metallic organic core. It was angry. Its remaining red lights intensified, burning brighter. With horrifying speed, it lunged downwards again, two of its massive pincer claws snapping open and shut with sickening force, tearing another ragged hole in the grating, forcing us to compress even further into the already minuscule space. I could feel its hot, foul breath, or whatever passed for it, on my face, a current of metallic decay. "The ladder!" I choked out, shoving Elias forward, my arm throbbing where the metal had cut it. "Go, now!" He didn't hesitate, scrambling on to the first rung of the corroded ladder, his movements desperate, panicked. I provided covering fire, emptying the remaining 2 shells in my shotgun into the creature's exposed underside, where the segmented plates met, hoping for a softer target. Bang! Bang! Again, the deafening blasts, the sickening recoil. This time, a torrent of the viscous green fluid erupted from the creature, splashing onto the platform, sizzling faintly. A deeper, more guttural roar tore from it, and it thrashed, its metallic limbs scraping wildly against the shaft walls, sending sparks flying. It was hurt, but not stopped, not even close. I threw the spent shotgun aside, drawing my sidearm. No time to reload. My pistol felt like a toy, but it was all I had left. I began scrambling up the ladder behind Elias, my hands slick with sweat and the blood from my cut arm. The rungs were old, rusted, biting into my palms. Every upward pull was an act of pure will. Below us, the creature roared again, shaking the entire shaft, its limbs slamming against the metal as it tried to follow. Its pincer claws scrabbled at the ladder, trying to rip it from its moorings. "Faster!" I yelled, pushing Elias, who was already moving with a desperate urgency, hauling himself upwards with an almost unnatural speed born of sheer terror. We ascended into the deeper, darker gloom, Elias's flashlight beam bouncing wildly, illuminating fleeting glimpses of the endless ladder, corroded and treacherous. The air grew thinner up here, heavy with the phantom weight of crushing pressure. As we climbed, the sounds from below began to fade, replaced by the persistent rhythmic thud, thud, thud of the rig's dying heart, the distant roar of the ocean, and a new, unsettling echo, a soft, almost musical humming. It wasn't the metallic screech of the creature, nor the groans of the rig. It was an ethereal, sustained note that seemed to resonate from the very fabric of the darkness above us, chilling me to the bone. Elias's head snapped up, his flashlight beam momentarily freezing on a section of the shaft wall just ahead. For a fleeting instant, the light caught something impossibly smooth, something that didn't belong. A faint, glowing symbol, intricate and alien, etched into the corroded steel. It was unlike any marking I'd ever seen, a whorl of impossible angles and glowing lines that seemed to pulse with a faint internal light, almost mirroring the creature's own red eyes. It vanished as Elias's light moved, leaving only the memory of its impossible geometry. What was that? Another loop, another question I didn't have time to answer. Then, from above, directly ahead of us, the humming intensified. It wasn't a mechanical hum, not exactly. It was too pure, too unsettling. And it was accompanied by a new, soft, wet, slithering sound. Not the heavy clanking, but something lighter, more insidious. Elias stopped climbing abruptly, his foot slipping on a rung, nearly sending him tumbling. "What the hell was that?" he whispered, his voice laced with renewed terror, his flashlight beam now fixed on the impenetrable darkness just above us. The humming grew louder, a chorus of dissonant, ethereal whispers that seemed to coalesce into a single, terrifying chord. And then, a new descent. Not the heavy, clanking metal monstrosity from below. No, this was something different, something lighter, faster, something that flowed. A sudden sharp crack echoed from directly above us. Not metal, but something organic, something that snapped like bone. Elias's flashlight beam shot upwards, momentarily illuminating a horror that made my blood run cold. It wasn't a creature. It was many creatures, dozens of them, smaller than the armored monstrosity, but far more agile. They looked like grotesque, elongated slugs, each the size of a grown man's arm, but with dozens of razor-sharp chitinous legs that clung to the shaft walls, moving with impossible speed. Their bodies were translucent, revealing pulsating organs and a network of dark veins. And each one glowed with that same eerie, ethereal humming, their bodies shimmering with an internal light that mirrored the symbol Elias had briefly illuminated. They were swarming, descending upon us in a silent, undulating wave, a living tide of humming, slithering terror. Elias screamed, a raw, primal sound of pure despair. Above, they're coming from above too. We were caught in the middle, the armored leviathan below, roaring and clawing its way up, and this new, silent, humming swarm cascading down from the darkness. There was no escape, no direction to run, no way to fight both. The shaft, our temporary refuge, had become a funnel of death. The air grew thick with the smell of them now, a sickeningly sweet odor, like rotting flowers and chemicals. It made my eyes water, my throat burn. My pistol was still in my hand, useless against this many. The rungs of the ladder felt greasy, slick. Below, the thudding growls of the armored beast intensified, closer now, its metallic claws tearing at the rungs beneath my feet. Above, the humming swarm descended, their translucent bodies gleaming, their razor-sharp legs clicking against the metal, their sickeningly sweet odor overwhelming. One of the humming slugs detached itself from the wall directly above Elias's head, its translucent body arcing through the air, heading straight for his face. Its numerous legs splayed, ready to latch on. Elias didn't even have time to scream again. We were trapped, and there was nowhere left to go. One of the humming slugs detached itself from the wall directly above Elias's head, its translucent body arcing through the air, heading straight for his face. Its numerous legs splayed, ready to latch on. Elias didn't even have time to scream again. We were trapped, and there was nowhere left to go. One of the humming slugs detached itself from the wall directly above Elias's head, its translucent body arcing through the air, heading straight for his face. Its numerous legs splayed, ready to latch on. Elias didn't even have time to scream again. We were trapped, and there was nowhere left to go. One of the humming slugs detached itself from the wall directly above Elias's head, its translucent body arcing through the air, heading straight for his face. Its numerous legs splayed, ready to latch on. Elias didn't even have time to scream again. We were trapped, and there was nowhere left to go. It struck him with a sickening, wet slap. The impact wasn't loud, but the sound resonated in the confined space, a fleshy thud against bone. Elias's head snapped back against the cold steel of the ladder, a choked gasp tearing from his throat. I saw his eyes widen, not with fear, but with a sudden, agonizing comprehension as the thing instantly adhered, its razor-sharp chitinous legs digging into the skin around his right eye, his temple, his cheek. A faint internal glow pulsed within its translucent body, mirroring the symbol that had once appeared to us as it began to root itself, to burrow. A scream finally ripped from Elias, not a sound of despair this time, but of pure, white-hot agony. His hands, still clutching the rungs, spasmed, fingers scrabbling. He clawed desperately at the slug, his fingernails tearing at the slick, rubbery flesh, but it held fast, its grip like iron. The air, already thick with the sweet chemical stench of the swarm, now carried a new, sharper tang, the metallic scent of fresh blood, as Elias's frantic efforts only seemed to drive the creature deeper. I could hear him choking, gargling, trying to scream around the obscenity affixed to his face. My pistol, still clenched uselessly in my hand, felt like a toy. It was too close, too entwined with Elias. One shot, and I'd blow his brains out alongside the slug's. My mind screamed, but my body moved on instinct, on adrenaline. I lunged, dropping my pistol with a clatter somewhere into the greasy darkness below, reaching for Elias, trying to pry the thing off him. My fingers slipped on its slick, moist surface, the skin feeling like cold, wet jelly stretched over something rigid and bony within. Its many legs, each one ending in a hooked barb, were already disappearing into Elias's flesh, a halo of dark red blooming around its opaque body. He thrashed, a violent, desperate dance on the precipice of the abyss, his weight shifting erratically on the ladder. "Hold on, Elias! Hold on!" I yelled, my voice raw, cracking. My own grip on the ladder was tenuous, sweat stinging my eyes, mixing with the overwhelming scent of decay and fear. But the ladder was already singing its own death rattle. The metallic groans from below intensified, closer than ever. The Leviathan wasn't just climbing, it was gnawing. Its metallic claws, massive and sharp as diamond, were tearing into the very structure of the shaft. A deep, resonant crack echoed through the narrow confines, not from below, but from just beneath Elias's thrashing feet. The steel rung he was gripping, already compromised by the constant stress and whatever acidic excretions the Leviathan was undoubtedly sloughing off, twisted. It didn't just bend, it snapped. The sound was shockingly loud, a shriek of tortured metal, followed by a sickening grind as the entire section of the ladder Elias was on detached from the wall. His wild thrashing, combined with the structural failure, was catastrophic. Elias didn't fall alone. The sudden violent shift in weight, the lurch, pulled me with him. My hands, slick with sweat and something else, Elias's blood or the slug's ichor, slipped. For a terrifying, endless second, I was airborne. My stomach lurched into my throat, a scream catching there, trapped. The air roared past my ears, the wind of my own descent. I saw Elias below me, his body plummeting faster, the slug still clinging to his face, his eyes wide with a terror that transcended pain. His limbs flailed like a broken marionette. He hit something metallic protruding from the wall a few feet down, a sudden, sickening thud that reverberated through the shaft. A deep, resonant crack echoed through the narrow confines, not from below, but from just beneath Elias's thrashing feet. The steel rung he was gripping, already compromised by the constant stress and whatever acidic excretions the Leviathan was undoubtedly sloughing off, twisted. It didn't just bend, it snapped. The sound was shockingly loud, a shriek of tortured metal, followed by a sickening grind as the entire section of the ladder Elias was on detached from the wall. His wild thrashing, combined with the structural failure, was catastrophic. Elias didn't fall alone. The sudden violent shift in weight, the lurch, pulled me with him. My hands, slick with sweat and something else, Elias's blood or the slug's ichor, slipped. For a terrifying, endless second, I was airborne. My stomach lurched into my throat, a scream catching there, trapped. The air roared past my ears, the wind of my own descent. I saw Elias below me, his body plummeting faster, the slug still clinging to his face, his eyes wide with a terror that transcended pain. His limbs flailed like a broken marionette.
He hit something metallic protruding from the wall a few feet down, a sudden, sickening thud that reverberated through the shaft.
A wet, guttural scream tore from him, cut short by another impact. Then a series of lesser, horrifying clangs as he continued to tumble into the darkness. I impacted the ladder again, not falling free, but slamming into the remaining section below the break. The air left my lungs in a violent whoosh, my ribs screaming in protest. A sharp, searing pain exploded in my right shoulder as it twisted awkwardly against the unforgiving steel. My left hand, somehow, miraculously, blindly found and clamped onto a rung. My vision swam, a kaleidoscope of dark and light, the world tilting precariously. I dangled, swaying like a pendulum, my body screaming, my muscles protesting the sudden shock. The smell of fear was thick in my mouth now, metallic and bitter, mingled with the acrid dust stirred up by Elias's fall. Below, the sounds of Elias hitting the bottom, or whatever awaited him there, were swallowed by the escalating roar of the Leviathan. It sounded jubilant, an ancient, predatory triumph, the hungry rumble of a beast that had just found its prey. I heard the squelch of something organic, followed by a wet, tearing sound, and then silence. A profound, terrifying silence where Elias had been. Above, the humming swarm descended relentlessly. They were closer now, a translucent, undulating curtain of horrors, their internal lights pulsing faster, like a collective heartbeat. The sickly sweet odor was suffocating, burning my nostrils, coating the inside of my throat with a cloying film that made me want to vomit. I could hear their razor-sharp legs clicking against the metal, 1,000 tiny, chitinous percussive instruments playing a death march. I hung there, one hand clamped around a greasy rung, my body screaming in agony, my shoulder a firestorm of pain. My pistol was gone, Elias was gone. I was alone, suspended between two horrors, the feasting Leviathan below and the silent, hungry swarm above. My breath hitched. The rungs felt greasy, slick. Was it the residue of the slugs or of something else, a new kind of slime oozing from the crumbling walls? My fingers, already raw, felt like they were losing purchase. I looked up, into the descending swarm, and then down, into the impenetrable darkness where Elias had vanished. There was nothing, just the reverberating echoes of his final tortured sounds. The sheer, overwhelming hopelessness of it threatened to drag me into the abyss before any monster could. Then, a flicker. Not from the translucent bodies of the slugs, not from the distant gleam of the Leviathan's eyes. This was different. A brief, almost imperceptible flash of blue light from a crevice high above, amidst the swarm, followed by a faint, static-laced zzz-kersh that cut through the humming and the growing thud of the Leviathan below. It was too faint to be a voice, too garbled to be a message, but it was unmistakably electronic. It was alien to this nightmare, a ghost of the world I'd left behind. A radio signal? But from where? No one was supposed to be left up here. No one but us. My heart hammered against my ribs, a sudden, irrational spike of hope, followed immediately by the crushing weight of reality. It was probably just interference, a dying shortwave radio from some forgotten, ruined comm station. A cruel trick of the mind. But it had sounded so close. The slugs above were now mere feet from me, their glistening bodies almost touching my outstretched arm as I clung to the rung. I could feel the faint vibration of their movement, the cold, alien touch of the air disturbed by their descent. One, larger than the rest, pulsed with an especially vivid blue-white light, its internal organs a writhing knot of dark shadows within its translucent form. Its multiple legs, like miniature surgical blades, splayed out, testing the air, seeking purchase. I could taste the dust and the metallic tang of fear, mixed with the cloying sweetness of the creatures, a sickening perfume that promised only rot and dissolution. My lungs burned for clean air, but there was only this thick, cloying miasma. I had to move. My shoulders screamed, a blinding white-hot agony whenever I put weight on it. I tried to pull myself up, to climb, but the pain was too much. The rungs were slick, my grip weakening. I gritted my teeth, a guttural growl escaping my lips. No, not like this. I wouldn't be another meal, another statistic in this endless, grinding horror. I still had one good arm, one good leg, one last breath. The Leviathan below intensified its roar. The metallic tearing became louder, more frantic, as if it sensed my vulnerability, my precarious perch. I heard the wet sound of something being torn apart, something large and resistant. Was it Elias? Or was the beast simply tearing the shaft apart in its hunger, in its rage? The very metal around me shuddered, vibrating with the Leviathan's monstrous exertions. Dust rained down, fine particles stinging my eyes, coating my tongue. I squeezed my eyes shut against the assault, my teeth gritted, tasting the grit and the coppery tang of my own fear. When I opened them, the world was a kaleidoscope of swirling shadows and pulsating light. The slugs were upon me. A dozen of them peeled off the wall, detaching from the main swarm with an unnerving grace, their translucent bodies arcing through the air towards me. They moved with a silent, terrifying efficiency, their numerous legs reaching, seeking purchase. I saw the individual barbs on their legs glistening with a dark, oily residue. They were like living scalpels, designed for incision, for penetration.
My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat of pure terror. My left hand, the only thing keeping me from plummeting into the Leviathan's maw, was shaking uncontrollably. My fingers were raw, scraped from the fall, the skin flayed in places, leaving bloody trails on the greasy rung. The pain in my shoulder was a constant blinding fire, threatening to consume what little resolve I had left. One slug, larger than the rest, landed on my forearm, just above the hand gripping the rung. I felt a sudden, cold pressure, followed by a sharp, searing pain as its legs dug in. It was like being stabbed by a dozen tiny, red-hot needles simultaneously. I screamed, a raw, primal sound, and instinctively tried to shake it off, but its grip was instantaneous, powerful. I could feel its body writhing, its internal glow intensifying, as if feeding on my fear, on my pain. Another slug landed on my exposed neck, just beneath my ear. Its legs clamped down, digging into the soft flesh. A jolt of agonizing pain shot through my jaw, down my spine. I could feel the strange, cold stickiness of its body against my skin, the faint, sickening vibration of its movement. My vision blurred. I was being consumed, piece by piece, while suspended over an even greater horror. I thrashed, desperate, my good arm flailing wildly. I slammed my hand against the slug on my forearm, crushing it with a wet pop. A burst of viscous, phosphorescent green ichor splattered across my hand, burning my skin like acid. The stench of it was overpowering, a concentrated dose of the sickly sweet chemical smell that had been filling the air, now sharp and acrid. I screamed again, a guttural shriek of agony. But there were more. They were swarming, landing on my leg, my chest, my exposed arms. I was being covered, enveloped by the glistening, translucent bodies, each one digging its barbed legs into my flesh, each one a fresh, agonizing stab. My entire body felt like it was on fire, 1,000 tiny blades tearing at me, burrowing deeper. The single rung I clung to felt impossibly far away. My grip was failing. My muscles were screaming, not just from the pain of the slugs, but from the sheer exhaustion of holding on, of fighting, of simply existing in this hell. My breath came in ragged, wheezing gasps. The constant thrumming of the swarm above, combined with the savage tearing and roaring of the Leviathan below, was a relentless assault on my senses, driving me closer and closer to madness. Through the haze of pain and overwhelming fear, I saw another flash. This time, it was from below. A quick, blinding pulse of red light, not from the monster, but from deep within the abyss, followed by a sound that made my blood run cold. A faint but distinct clink of metal against rock. A sound that could only be a pickaxe, or something similar, something human. No, impossible. But the light had been there. The sound had been there. Another survivor? Or something else entirely? Something that had been down there with the Leviathan all along? The slugs on my body were digging deeper. I could feel them writhing, their internal lights pulsing with a sickening hunger. One had found its way to my face, its cold, slick body pressing against my cheek, its legs probing, seeking purchase. I could feel the sharp, agonizing bite as it began to pierce my skin. I tried to pull my head back, to shake it off, but my limbs felt heavy, unresponsive. My strength was fading. The rungs, slick with ichor, blood, and grime, felt impossibly far. The world was kilting, the darkness below swirling, inviting. I heard the Leviathan let out another thunderous roar, a sound of unholy triumph and insatiable hunger. It was directly below me now, its massive head probably just out of sight, its hot, foul breath rising in noxious waves. The vibrations from its movements shook the entire shaft, threatening to dislodge me entirely. I was falling, or I was being pulled. The single rung I clung to began to peel away from the wall, groaning under the impossible strain. My good arm, locked in a death grip, was tearing itself apart. The slugs on my body were a writhing, pulsing cloak of agony, their legs digging in, burrowing, feeding. My vision was tunneling, darkening at the edges. And then, just as I felt the rung finally give way, heard the shriek of tearing metal and the sickening rip of my own muscles, a new sound. A monster screeching crack from above, much closer than the swarm. Not the slugs, something else. The very structure of the rig, the upper sections of the shaft, seemed to be giving way. The darkness above was no longer just the night sky, but a cascade of crumbling concrete and twisted metal plummeting down towards me. I was falling, the slugs still clinging, feeding, my body screaming, and now the entire world was falling with me. I was falling. The words echoed in the raw, burning canyons of my throat, unspoken, unheard over the shriek of tearing metal and the guttural roar of the Leviathan below. The slugs, a living shroud of agony, pulled at my flesh, their tiny razor-sharp hooks digging deeper with every shift, every impact. My good arm, still locked in that death grip on a rung that had ceased to be, was screaming its own surrender, the muscles in my shoulder ripping like wet paper. My vision, already a tunnel of encroaching darkness, flickered with sparks as I scraped against something unseen, a jagged edge of the collapsing rig. The sickening rip was not just the metal, not just my muscles, but the very fabric of my world. One moment I was clinging, however futilely. The next, the single bent rung vaporized in my grasp, not tearing, but simply ceasing to be. It was as if the shaft itself had exhaled, expelling me into the hungry maw of the abyss. And then the deluge. The monstrous, screeching crack from above wasn't a warning, it was a prelude to an avalanche. The darkness above wasn't just night, it was solid, tangible. A massive section of the upper shaft, concrete, rebar, twisted catwalks, and heavy machinery, let go. It didn't just fall, it imploded, collapsing in on itself with a sound that swallowed all other noise, a deafening symphony of destruction. My fall, already accelerating, was suddenly eclipsed. The air was ripped from my lungs, not by speed, but by the sheer kinetic force of the collapsing structure.
Chunks of concrete, some the size of small vehicles, hurtled past me, kicking up a whirlwind of pulverized dust and fine grit-like debris that stung my eyes and clogged my nostrils. The smell was acrid, metallic, like burnt circuitry mixed with damp earth and the raw mineral scent of exposed stone. I choked, a ragged gasp that offered no relief. I twisted, a desperate, flailing puppet, trying to shield my head, trying to make myself smaller, trying to disappear. A cascade of smaller debris, jagged shrapnel of glass and splintered composite panels, rained down on me, pinging off my helmet, biting into the exposed skin of my neck and hands where the slugs weren't already feasting. Each impact was a new jolt of pain, a fresh blossom of agony, adding to the garden of torment already blooming on my body. The slugs, though, they seemed to thrive on the chaos, burrowing deeper, their writhing movements intensifying, as if this final violent descent was their ultimate feast. Below, the Leviathan's roar was no longer one of unholy triumph, but of pure, unadulterated rage. The collapse of the rig was undoubtedly disturbing its hunting ground, its lair, perhaps even threatening it. The sound, deeper and more guttural than anything I'd heard before, seemed to shake the very foundations of the world, rattling my bones within my skin. The darkness below me was suddenly illuminated, briefly, by what could only be the creature's bioluminescence, a sickly, greenish-yellow glow that pulsed and receded, like a dying star in the depths. And then a colossal splash, a sound that dwarfed the falling rig, as if the Leviathan was thrashing, furious, perhaps even rising to meet the descending debris. I was plummeting, my senses overwhelmed. The rushing wind roared in my ears, a high-pitched shriek competing with the grinding, tearing agony of the rig's demise. The taste of fear, coppery and bitter, filled my mouth, mingling with the metallic tang of my own blood. I could feel the slugs on my back, the sickening sensation of their hundreds of tiny legs, like an army of needles boring into me. My limbs felt heavy, unresponsive, yet I thrashed instinctively, a desperate, futile dance against gravity and annihilation. My head snapped back, cracking against something hard and unforgiving, a piece of falling rebar perhaps, or a stray loose panel. White-hot pain lanced through my skull, and for a terrifying second, my vision went entirely black, replaced by a symphony of exploding colors behind my eyes. I felt a jarring thud against my side, a bone-jarring impact that stole the air from my lungs and left me gasping, convulsing. I was sure a rib had cracked, perhaps more. The shock of it, however, brought with it an unexpected, momentary reprieve from the swirling darkness. As my vision swam back into focus, distorted and blurry, I realized I wasn't free-falling anymore, not entirely. The impact hadn't killed me, hadn't pulverized me. Instead, it had slammed me against a colossal piece of the rig that was still plummeting downwards, but at a slightly different, slower velocity than the surrounding shrapnel. It was a massive section of the access tunnel's inner lining, a curved, thick-walled segment of reinforced steel and concrete, perhaps 20 feet long and 10 feet wide, ripped clean from its moorings. It spun gently as it fell, groaning under its own weight, sparks showering from its fractured edges as it scraped against the remaining, agonizingly slow-to-fall sections of the shaft. This was it, my final descent. But for a fleeting, desperate second, I had found a strange metal lifeline. My good arm, responding with an almost superhuman surge of adrenaline, somehow clamped onto a protruding stub of rebar, slick with slime in my own blood. My fingers, raw and screaming, locked around it, holding on with a desperate, white-knuckled grip that threatened to tear my entire hand off. The other arm, limp and useless, flopped against my side, sending fresh waves of nausea through me. I was clinging to a piece of a falling world, a small, twisted comfort. This massive piece of the rig was still hurtling towards the abyss, towards the enraged Leviathan, but it was something. It was a surface, a momentary shield against the smaller, sharper debris still raining down. My helmet, jarred from the impact, felt loose. My comms unit, long dead, suddenly crackled. It was a weak, barely audible sound beneath the cacophony of destruction, a thin, almost ghostly hiss of static. I blinked, my eyes watering from the dust and the agony, trying to make sense of it. Then, a voice, or what sounded like a voice, garbled, distorted, filled with a horrific, alien-sounding white noise that grated on my ears. Not static. They're static. Help us. Static. The static. Hollow, wet gurgle. The signal cut out as quickly as it had appeared, leaving behind only the ringing in my ears and the echoing fear it had ignited. Help us? Who? From what? The thought was a searing ember in the whirlwind of my terror. Was it an old recording, a ghost in the machine, or was someone, somewhere, still alive, still sending out a dying cry into the void? The static had been laced with something wet, a sound that resonated with the sickening slurping of the slugs on my back. I tried to turn my head, my neck protesting with a fiery ache, to examine the comm unit, to see if it was damaged beyond repair, if I could somehow re-establish contact. But I couldn't. My head was pinned, my good arm locked, my body screaming. And as I lay there, pressed against the cold, unforgiving metal of the falling debris, my eyes scanned the ravaged interior of this colossal chunk of rig. It was like looking into the dissected guts of a dying beast. Twisted pipes, shredded wires, mangled equipment, a landscape of mechanical despair. And then I saw it, or thought I did. Amidst the chaos, amidst the sparks and the brief sickening flashes of green light from below, the Leviathan thrashing, perhaps rising to meet us, there was a shape. Not a piece of metal, not a shadow cast by the falling debris, but a distinct, unsettling form. It was wedged between two buckling support beams within the hollow, ruptured interior of the falling rig section, partially obscured by dangling wires and concrete dust. It was large, dark, and utterly motionless, too large to be human, even contorted, too defined to be merely a trick of the light or shadow. It was vaguely humanoid in its overall outline, but grotesquely elongated, with limbs that seemed to bend at unnatural angles, and a head that was far too small, a mere knot on a massive hunched torso. It seemed almost embedded in the structure itself, as if it had been there, part of the rig, all along. It wasn't falling with the frantic tumbling chaos of everything else. It was pinned, caught, a silent, macabre passenger on this ride to hell. My breath hitched, my heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic trapped bird. What in God's name was that? Was it one of them? One of the things that had caused all this? Or something else entirely? A new terror, a fresh, cold dread began to seep into my already saturated soul. It hadn't moved, not a twitch. But its presence, its sheer wrongness, was palpable. The structure I was clinging to shuddered violently. We were picking up speed again, the air rushing past with renewed fury. The Leviathan's roars intensified, now sounding closer, more resonant, as if the monster was directly beneath us, its colossal maw opening wide to receive its falling feast. The greenish-yellow light pulsed again, brighter this time, illuminating the sheer scale of the abyss and the frothing, turbulent waters far, far below. Then, a new, horrifying realization dawned. The massive section of the rig I was clinging to, my temporary, false hope, was not falling straight. It was beginning to tilt. Slowly at first, then with increasing speed, it began to yaw, to rotate, its fractured edges grinding against the rapidly approaching shaft walls. My grip, already failing, screamed in protest. The slugs on my back, sensing the shift, burrowed in deeper, their frenzied movements a perverse mockery of my own desperation. The world spun. The abyss below was no longer a distant threat, but a rapidly approaching, swirling vortex of dark water and monstrous hunger. The dark, elongated shape embedded in the falling debris was now directly above me, its horrific outline momentarily silhouetted against the dim, distant light of the surface far, far above. The tilt became a full-blown tumble. The rebar I clung to threatened to rip from its mooring, and with it, my hand. My body was flailing, battered against the hard, unforgiving metal. The air screamed past me, a gale-force wind threatening to tear me clean off. My last thought, before the world truly inverted, before the massive piece of rig became a giant spinning lethal centrifuge, was of the thing embedded above me. It was still there, still silent, still utterly terrifying. And then, with a deafening screech of rending metal, the entire structure I was clinging to impacted something else. A colossal, shuddering blow that reverberated through every bone in my body, knocking the air from my lungs for the final time. My grip sheared. My body was flung outwards, not into the open air, but into a confined, rapidly narrowing space. The smell of burning lubricant and ozone filled my nostrils. The pressure was immense. I was being crushed. The world went black, not from darkness, but from an impact so profound, so devastating, that it felt like the very concept of me was being obliterated. I wasn't falling anymore. I was being squeezed, pressed, fragmented. The roaring abyss and the hungry leviathan, they were no longer a worry.
Because I was being consumed by the very rig itself, pressed between two massive, grinding plates of steel, descending into the dark, churning depths, my existence shrinking to a singular, agonizing point of absolute oblivion. My existence shrank to a singular, agonizing point of absolute oblivion. The grinding plates of steel, hot with friction, tasted of scorched metal and my own blood as they closed around me, a vice tightening around my core. There was no pain, not anymore, just a profound, crushing emptiness, a scream that had no air to carry it, no throat to form it. This was it, the end. Not a glorious last stand, not a defiant roar, but a whimper swallowed by the ravenous maw of the dying rig. My consciousness, a flickering ember, threatened to snuff out. And then, with the last, desperate gasp of the rig's dying heart, something gave. Not me, but the structure itself. A violent shudder ripped through the steel plates, a sound like 1,000 angry giants tearing their own flesh. The pressure, instead of increasing, shifted. A burst of acrid steam, smelling of burnt oil and something chemical, erupted from a ruptured pipe directly beside my head, scalding my cheek. The shock, the sudden change, momentarily stunned the crushing embrace. And in that fractional second, the plates shifted outward. Not much, a mere inch, but enough. Enough for a sliver of darkness, a vertical slit, to appear. My instinct, primal and raw, screamed for survival. I contorted, a bone-jarring, muscle-shredding effort, forcing my mangled frame through the narrow gap. The sharp edges of the torn metal raked my skin, shredding my suit, peeling flesh from bone. I didn't feel it. I felt only the desperate need to escape the crushing. I plunged downwards, a chaotic, uncontrolled fall through a labyrinth of twisted pipes and mangled machinery. The air was thick with smoke, dust, and the metallic tang of fresh destruction. I slid, scraped, tumbled, until I landed with a sickening thud on a pile of debris, the impact rattling my teeth, sending a jolt of white-hot agony through my already shattered ribs. I lay there, wheezing, tasting bile and dust, the metallic tang of my own fear thick on my tongue. The world spun. My vision was a kaleidoscope of red and black. Above me, the remnants of the rig groaned, a dying beast in its death throes. I pushed myself up, every movement a fresh hell. My right arm hung limp, a wet crunch confirming a clean break. My left leg screamed with a burning pain. But I was alive, somehow. The air in this section was different, less fire, more stagnation.
a heavy, cloying scent of seawater mixed with something organic and deeply unpleasant, like rotten kelp and decaying meat. It clung to the back of my throat, making my stomach clench.
I squinted through the gloom. The interior of the rig, what was left of it, was a chaotic mess of sparking wires, dripping oil, and jagged metal. Beyond the immediate wreckage, I could make out a tunnel, an access way perhaps, half submerged in murky water. A distant rhythmic thump, thump, thump echoed through the water, a sound of heavy machinery or something far more unsettling. "Hello?" My voice was a raspy whisper, thin and broken. No reply. Only the groan of the dying rig, the drip, drip, drip of water, and that distant, ominous rhythm. I pushed myself forward, dragging my injured leg, using my good arm to brace against the walls. The water in the accessway was cold, quickly rising to my waist. It stank of brine and something else, something metallic and fishy that clung to my skin like slime. My boots squelched. Then I saw it. A faint flickering light ahead. Hope, a fragile, treacherous thing, surged. "Anyone there?" I yelled, louder this time, my voice raw. The light flickered again, resolving into the unsteady beam of a headlamp. A figure emerged from the murk, silhouetted against a slightly wider chamber. "Jensen, is that you, you son of a bitch?" It was Miller. Blood streaked his face. His uniform was torn, but he was alive. Behind him, huddled in a small, relatively dry alcove, were 3 others. Kai, the young comms tech, shivering uncontrollably. Lena, the rig medic, her face pale but determined, clutching a makeshift first aid kit. And, surprisingly, Captain Thorne himself, slumped against the wall, his eyes glazed, a deep gash on his forehead. "Miller," I gasped, slumping against a bulkhead. The relief was a physical weight, almost as crushing as the steel plates had been. "What happened?" "What didn't happen?" Miller barked, his voice hoarse. "Rigs going down, bottoms ripped out. It's only a matter of time before we're at the bottom of the trench. We managed to get clear of the main collapse, found this old service tunnel. Thorne's out of it, took a hit to the head. Lena's trying to stop the bleeding." I pushed through the water, the cold seeping into my bones. Kai looked up, his eyes wide and vacant. "They're coming, Jensen. I heard them. Down here. They're already inside." My blood ran cold. The thought of those things, those monstrous, starved horrors, navigating the flooded, twisting corridors of the rig, sent a fresh wave of terror through me. "How far down are we?" Lena looked up, her hands still pressing a compress to Thorne's head. "Too far. We're well below the surface. The whole rig's essentially an inverted cage, sinking slowly. We were heading for the escape pods, but the path was blocked. And that's when we started hearing them below us." Her voice was tight with suppressed fear. "The sound, it's not like anything I've ever heard. A clicking, chittering thing, mixed with a low, guttural moan." "The seismic readings," I muttered, remembering the tremors, the anomalous signatures. "They weren't just outside. They were always below us. We disturbed them." Miller pulled a heavy wrench from his belt, his knuckles white. "Doesn't matter now. We need to find a way out. Lena says there's a deep-sea submersible bay, old, unused, further down. It might have a comms array or even a functional sub." "Further down?" My gut twisted. "Deeper into their territory?" "It's the only way, Jensen," Lena said, her voice grim. "Unless you have a better idea of how to get off a sinking oil rig at the bottom of the ocean." The choice was stark. Drown, be crushed, or descend further into the abyss to face unimaginable horrors. We chose the latter. It took hours. Every step was agony, every splash of water against my face a fresh reminder of our encroaching doom. The air grew colder, heavier, saturated with that sickening organic smell. The rhythmic thump, thump, thump grew louder, pulsating through the water, vibrating through the metal deck plates beneath our feet. We moved in silence, broken only by Kai's whimpers and the scraping of our gear. We found the submersible bay.
It was a cavernous, forgotten space, dimly lit by emergency lights that flickered and died as we watched. Two hulking, ancient deep-sea submersibles sat in their berths, covered in decades of dust and grime. They looked like sarcophagi, their portholes dark, like dead eyes. "No way these are working," Miller breathed, his voice flat. But Lena, ever the pragmatist, was already at a console, wiping grime from a screen. "They're designed to be airtight, self-contained. If we can get power, there's an emergency generator down here." As she worked, the thump, thump, thump intensified, now accompanied by a wet scraping sound like claws on metal. A chill, colder than the deep-sea water, swept through the bay. The smell intensified, a reek of decay and ammonia, thick enough to taste, coating our tongues. "They're close," Kai whimpered, pointing a shaking finger at the far end of the bay, where an access tunnel opened into the blackness. Lena gasped. The console screen flickered to life, bathing her face in a sickly green glow. "I've got power, but the comms, they're completely scrambled, and the main thrusters are offline. We'd have to use the emergency ones, which are slow, very slow." Before she finished speaking, a shadow detached itself from the blackness of the tunnel. It was huge, vaguely humanoid, but twisted, elongated, its limbs too long, its head too small, crowned with what looked like a pulsating bioluminescent growth. It moved with a horrifying, disjointed grace, its multi-jointed legs clicking on the metal. Its skin, if it was skin, seemed translucent, revealing a network of pulsing veins beneath. And those eyes, not eyes, but glowing orbs, utterly alien, utterly predatory. It lifted a six-fingered hand, claws gleaming in the dim light, and scraped it across the metal wall. The sound was like 1,000 nails on a chalkboard, raw and agonizing. Miller roared, raising his wrench. "Get in the sub, now!" He charged, a desperate, futile act of defiance. The creature met him, a blur of motion. Miller's wrench connected with a sickening crack, but the creature barely flinched. Its claws lashed out, tearing through Miller's suit, carving deep gouges in his chest. He screamed, a guttural sound of pain and rage, before the creature clamped a hand around his head, its digits pressing into his skull. There was a wet crunch, and Miller went limp, his body dropping to the metal deck with a heavy splash. "Miller!" I screamed, lunging forward, my broken arm a useless weight. Lena grabbed my good arm, pulling me back towards the nearest submersible. "No, there's nothing you can do," she shrieked, her voice cracking. "Get in! Kai, help me with Thorn!" We scrambled into the ancient sub, the hatch clanging shut behind us with a deafening finality. The air inside was stale, metallic, and carried the ghost of the ocean's rot. Lena furiously worked the controls. The sub shuddered, a deep vibration running through its hull. The emergency thrusters whined, a high-pitched shriek of tortured metal. Outside, through the reinforced viewport, we could see more of them, emerging from the tunnels, their glowing eyes reflecting in the water, their shapes undulating in the gloom. The smell of decay was somehow seeping even through the thick hull. The sub began to move, agonizingly slowly, scraping against the berth. The creatures outside seemed to sense our escape. One of them, larger than the rest, its pulsating head growth of vibrant green, lunged at the viewport, its claws scraping, leaving deep gouges in the thick glass. The sound was unbearable, a tearing, grinding shriek. Kai screamed, burying his face in his hands. Thorn, semi-conscious, moaned softly. "Hold on," Lena yelled, her face streaming with sweat. "We're going to the surface. It'll take hours at this speed." Hours. Hours of clinging to the hope of a surface that might not even be there anymore, or a safe zone that might be a lie. The bitter irony wasn't lost on me. We were escaping the known terror of the deep for the unknown terror above. The sub slowly broke free of the rig's collapsing structure, rising ponderously through the murky water. I watched the rig disappear below, a skeletal leviathan sinking into the abyss. The climb was slow, torturous. We passed through layers of thermal vents where superheated water steamed against the viewport. We saw glimpses of other, stranger creatures, ones that thrived in the crushing darkness and scalding heat, their forms grotesque and beautiful in equal measure. The air in the sub became heavy with the recycled stench of our own fear and desperation. Then, finally, after what felt like an eternity, a faint gray light appeared above us. Dawn, or what passed for it. The light grew, turning the water from inky black to a pale, sickly green. And then, with a jarring lurch, we breached the surface. The world outside was a nightmare I had not yet fully comprehended. The ocean was not calm. It was a graveyard. Debris from the rig, pieces of human civilization, floated everywhere. But it wasn't just metal and plastic. There were bodies, hundreds of them, bloated, gray, bobbing gently in the oily slicks. Some were missing limbs, others were horribly disfigured, their faces frozen in silent screams. The smell hit us instantly, even through the sub's filters. The unmistakable, stomach-churning stench of death and decay, mixed with the sharp tang of crude oil and something else, something metallic and sweet that turned my stomach. "My God," Lena whispered, covering her mouth. "It's worse." Through the viewpoint, I saw it, the horizon, or what should have been the horizon. Instead of an open expanse, there was a massive, impossibly long structure stretching across the entire visible curve of the ocean. A wall, made of some dull, dark material, rising hundreds of meters into the sky, disappearing into a perpetual storm-darkened cloud cover. And along its length, spaced at regular intervals, were gargantuan, flood-lit platforms, bristling with communication arrays, spotlights, and what looked like enormous heavy-caliber weapon emplacements. "The safe zone," I breathed, a cold dread coiling in my gut. It wasn't a zone, it was a barrier. Lena was frantically trying the comms again, her fingers flying over the console. "I'm getting faint signals, data bursts, encrypted. Oh God." Her face went white, her eyes wide with horror. "Jensen, it's not a safe zone. It's a quarantine, a containment wall." "Containment for what?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. The smell of death was overwhelming. She fumbled, pulling up a schematic on a secondary screen, her hands shaking. "The data, it's old, predating the rig. This wasn't built after the outbreak. It was built before. This entire region, this deep-sea trench, it was designated a containment zone for something they knew was down here, something they were trying to suppress." The image on the screen was a map. A vast, circular area of the ocean, stretching for thousands of kilometers. And our rig, the Prometheus, was directly in the center of it, marked with a flashing red X. Underneath it, in stark, clinical text, were the words, "Containment Breach." Initial vector, deep core drilling operations. My blood ran cold, colder than the abyss we had just escaped. We hadn't accidentally unleashed a horror. We were the horror, drilling into a sealed tomb, releasing something ancient, something unimaginable on the world. The Leviathan below wasn't the enemy. It was just an angry, disturbed tenant. The real architects of this apocalypse were the ones who sent us down there. And then the twist, the final, gut-wrenching realization slammed into me with the force of 1,000 atmospheres. Lena, pale and trembling, pointed at another part of the data. And this, the safe zone protocols. Anyone who breaches the containment wall, any survivor, they're to be processed. Her voice choked on the word. Not rescued, processed. They're scanning for anomalous biological markers, for infection, for mutation. They're not looking for survivors to save. They're looking for hosts. The safe zone wasn't a sanctuary. It was a processing plant for us, for anyone who had survived the horrors of the deep, who had carried the scent of its infection, however faintly, on their skin or in their blood. We were not escaping. We were merely delivering ourselves to the next stage of our torment. A low, insistent hum filled the sub. I looked up. Above us, from one of the massive platforms on the wall, a small, sleek drone, its surface dull black and ominous, descended towards us. It was fast, silent, its single red eye glowing with cold, mechanical intent. It wasn't coming to rescue us. It was coming to collect. Kai began to sob, a broken, desperate sound. Thorn stirred, his eyes fluttering open, clouded with confusion and a hint of the deep, lingering fear. He saw the drone, then the wall, then the endless floating dead. His eyes fixed on mine, and in their depths I saw a flicker of understanding, a dawning horror that mirrored my own. The world had not ended in a bang, nor in the teeth of some primordial beast. It had ended in silence, in a sterile, clinical betrayal. We were the last, pathetic fruits of an experiment gone horribly, catastrophically wrong. The horrors of the deep were just the appetizer. The true nightmare had been carefully cultivated, contained, and now, unleashed, would be meticulously processed by the very civilization that birthed it. The new world wasn't a world of hope or even defiant struggle. It was a sterile, controlled abattoir. And we, the last few, were merely the next in line.
The drone hummed closer, its red eye growing larger, brighter, mirroring the singular, agonizing point of oblivion that awaited us. We had drilled too deep, not just into the earth, but into the very heart of human hubris, and found nothing but endless, cold, mechanical despair.